Professor George Szamuely is one of Europe's finest intellectuals and commentators. Who better to talk to about the crises, multiple crises in Europe? The European Parliament elections coming up in the next few days. Who will win them? Who will lose? What the impact of those elections will be, if anything, on the course of European policy towards the East, towards Russia, towards China, towards the Israel-Palestine conflict, and that about to erupt between Israel and Lebanon. I'm very glad to say that Professor George has agreed to join us again this evening. Professor, let's start, if we may, with the very dire situation now on the front line. The Western governments have authorized the Zelensky regime to use the long-range weapons that they have supplied them. And indeed, they require the Western technical military specialists in order to use them, but they have authorized them to be fired inside Russia, at Russian cities. Russia has warned that this will mean World War III, that they reserve the right to react preemptively, and they reserve the right to attack NATO itself, both inside Ukraine, but most crucially outside Ukraine. That this, in other words, is an existential moment for them. Nobody in Britain knows anything about this. I'm wondering how seriously you view it.
Well, George, I view it extremely seriously because, of course, what the United States, Great Britain, France have done is they've given a blank check to Ukraine to use their weapons deep inside Russia. And what always happens in these situations is that, as we have the very dishonest exercise being practiced by the United States, they say, oh, no, it has to be very, very limited. It's all to do with Kharkov, just a few miles across the Russian border. That's all you're allowed to do. But of course, everyone knows that that's just simply the crossing the Rubicon. Once you've signed off on that, then of course, the very next day, they're going to start hitting other targets. And of course, Ukraine has done that. The very next day, Ukraine hit the anti-missile systems, the S-300, S-400 missile systems in Belgorod using its HIMARS. And of course, we know the consequence. The consequence is no consequence. And of course, then Ukraine will continue to strike targets deep inside Russia. And of course, as the Russians have pointed out repeatedly, Ukraine is incapable of doing this alone. It is obvious this is being done by NATO, is using satellite technology, the satellite technology provided by the United States. It's the United States that is firing these missiles inside Russia, and Russia cannot tolerate this. This has to end, and I think Russia has given fair warning, and I would think that the next step will be Russia hitting some NATO targets. I would imagine probably they're going to hit some American satellites. They're probably going to hit American AWACS systems, drones, and then we'll see what the next step might be. Airfields maybe in Poland and Romania, but basically Russia cannot allow the United States just simply to start hitting targets inside Russia and killing Russians on Russian territory.
As you explain it there, no sensible person could imagine that Russia could allow that. Therefore, any sensible person would have to conclude that this is a direct act of war by Western countries against a nuclear-armed superpower called Russia. And any sensible person would conclude that to do such a thing and risk the end of humanity, the end of the world, is something we really ought not to do. But only Hungary and Serbia in Europe appear to have spoken out against it.
Yep, that's exactly so. And what was striking about what Hungary in particular, Viktor Orban said, is saying twice, two world wars, we Hungarians were pushed into a war against Russia, specifically two world wars. World War in 1914, 1941, we were pushed by other powers into a war with Russia. It ended absolutely catastrophically for Hungarians. In the First World War, it ended in the Treaty of Trianon. Hungary lost 70% of its territory. World War II, Hungary lost its freedom. It had 40 years of communism. Yeah, he said, we're not going to do it a third time. And I think that's what was important. He's the only leader who has pointed out that this is exactly the same project that Europe planned in 1914 and in 1941, which is uniting the European continent against Russia. It ended catastrophically both times. And now it's exactly the same plan. And when you have pretty much the same people like Ursula von der Leyen and Annalena Baerbock, whose grandfathers were actually fighting against Russia, and they're using the same language, the same rhetoric, the same demonization of Russia, the same obsessive hatred of Russia. After all the pledges that Germany had made at the time of the reunification, henceforth only peace will emanate from German soil, Germany has gone all the way back to exactly that same hatred and the same desire to unite a continent against Russia.
Is it because the rest of Europe simply doesn't understand the seriousness of this situation? I mean, I saw I think Salvini in Italy give a very robust statement about Macron, telling him to put his tin hat on and go to the front. But he's the only other one I've seen anywhere in Western Europe, and no government in Western Europe, other than Hungary and Serbia, has formally opposed this. Is it because of ignorance or because we're all up for World War III?
I think it's ignorance. I think it's unfortunate that unlike at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we no longer have anyone around who has a living memory of World War. And so we now have a dim-witted generation who think that they can play this little game of bluffing. And that's how Macron describes it. Oh, well, we're going to create uncertainty in the minds of the Russian leaders, and the Russian leaders will magically go away, because they'll suddenly realize that, oh, well, we're really afraid of NATO, and they're going to slink away and capitulate. This kind of nonsensical thinking is now prevails throughout Europe. So it's both ignorance, a lack of imagination, and unfortunately, total, absolute, abject surrender to the United States.
It has the feel of August 1914 about it to me, the road to Sarajevo. Does it feel that way to you? You are in Central Europe. Does it feel that way to you?
Yes, it is. Because, how do you get to war? You get to war because one side seems to be under the ludicrous impression that it can secure an easy victory, really without making too much of an effort, and that the other side is just going to simply slink away. It will just simply, surrender, capitulate. And that's what NATO is thinking. NATO somehow thinks, well, we're much stronger than Russia. Russia is more afraid of us than we are of them. So if we get tough, if we keep escalating and say we're going to do this, this, and this, Russia will eventually realize, well, we can't take this, and we'll just go away and sign on the dotted line. And that's the NATO thinking. And Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, keeps saying, well, we need to send more and more arms into Ukraine, because the more we send, the sooner Russia will capitulate and come to the negotiating table. No evidence whatever to back this up, and yet he continues to espouse this nonsense. And unfortunately, the public just seems completely asleep. I mean, the media, as usual, doing a terrible job. They're not really telling them how serious the situation is. But that's how political leaders are getting away with it, as they got away with it in 1914. I think it was a little bit more excuse then, because they didn't really have democracies then. But basically it is. I mean, it's these terrible, incompetent leaders who are leading Europe into this catastrophe.
You mentioned democracy. It's about to be exercised across the European Union. Will the parliament elected change things? How are you expecting the parliament to break? Victories for people who want peace, or more victories for people who want war?
I think I don't think there's going to be much of a mandate for peace. I think there will be a move to the right, but I don't think it will be quite as substantial as we may have thought a few months ago. The key was the massive operation that was done on the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. The entire German government, the security apparatus, the media launched a kind of a 2-3 pronged attack on the AfD, accusing it of collaborating with Putin, collaborating with Xi, being neo-Nazis and so on. And they've dipped in the polls. So where we were, it seemed like they were in the mid-20s and, heading towards where the Christian Democrats were. Now they've already sunk down to about 15-16%. And I think if they don't do well, then I don't think there is really going to be any kind of a basis for a peace party. So although there will be a move to the right, the Greens are going to do very poorly. I don't think it's going to translate into any sort of a mandate for peace. And who knows, Ursula von der Leyen may even be re-elected for another term.
God forbid. What about my co-thinker, Sarah Wagenknecht on the left in Germany? How do you think she's going to do?
Well, that's very interesting. At the moment, she's doing better than the Free Democrats. So that's a very much a joker in the pack, because if she can reach something like maybe 7, 8, 9%, then I think she's well placed for the elections next year, and could then be a serious force. But she has to at least get into that sort of 7, 8, 9, close to 10% of the vote. Then she can establish herself as a serious force.
And of course, these right-wing people that you speak of, and isn't it ironic that for a peace party to emerge, the right wing have to do well, how things have changed. The thing about these right-wingers, though, is once they get in, they become poodles for the Americans, for the globalists. Meloni is a good example in Italy. There's no difference at all between Meloni's policy and the centrist swamp that she defeated.
No, exactly right. And she, who knows what goes on behind the scenes, why she turned out to be as pathetic as she was. The first thing she did as soon as she won the election is to start hanging out and cavorting with Zelensky. I suspect Marine Le Pen will be very much the same. I mean, the national rally is expected to do well on Sunday. I don't expect too much from her. The unfortunate thing also when it comes to the right, that, and as you know, George, a lot of them are extremely pro-Israeli. And in fact, you'd have to wonder what goes on there, but somehow they have been persuaded by the Israel lobby that somehow Israel is the paradigm of the nation state. Israel is the paradigm of the state fighting for national sovereignty, the paradigm of someone fighting against the forces of globalism. And so the various forces on the right in Europe, who supposedly are for peace, are absolutely gung-ho for Israel. And that goes through in France, Geert Wilders and so on. And then, of course, even got people in the UK like Nigel Farage, and they're all in love with Israel. So again, that calls into question, their commitment to peace.
Yes, Donald Trump's another good example. He's for peace in Ukraine, but war in the Middle East.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly right. It's a very strange, and I think Israel is masterful at tailoring its message to every part of the electorate. So when it comes to the liberal left, then suddenly, oh, we have to fight Hamas on behalf of the LGBTQ plus people. When it comes to the right, it says, well, we have to fight against Hamas because this is the fight against the woke culture. It's the fight against the global jihadis. It's the fight against the globalism. So it's a message tailored to every segment of the populace. And of course, the right just buys into this, I think, hook, line, and sinker.
Professor George, thank you as always for your wisdom and your time. Dr. George Szamuely, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute and author of a great book, by the way, Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia.